for more than 3,000 years. A question, simple in appearance, has haunted historians, believers, and the curious. Who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? We know the name of Moses. We know the Hebrew people who flee. We even know, in the smallest details, the plagues that strike Egypt. But he, the ruler who refuses, who resists, who pursues, the Pharaoh whom Moses dares to challenge, in the name of an invisible God, and whom tradition imagines swallowed up with his army, he remains without a name. In ancient Egypt, a name is not a simple label, or an era. It is a victory over death. It is a trace carved for eternity. So why, in one of the most famous narratives in the world, does the Pharaoh of Egypt have no name? Today, we are going to follow the thread back. We are going to follow the ancient texts, scrutinize the carved stones, listen to the arguments of archaeologists and specialists, and see how far they can bring us closer to this question. Who really was that Pharaoh of the Exodus? Everything begins, according to the biblical story, in a land that has become a prison. Egypt. Not a desert prison, a fertile one. A prison of riverbanks, granaries, walls, and quotas. A foreign people has lived here for generations. They arrived as guests. They stayed as workers. And one day, in the logic of empires, they become a threat. The text says the Egyptians fear their numbers. So the rhythm changes. Work becomes a weapon. Control becomes a habit. And the days grow heavy. Mud, straw, kills, heat. A life measured in bricks. The story lingers on that detail for a reason. Because oppression isn't always chains, sometimes it's repetition. The same gesture, the same load, the same command. Until a people forgets what freedom feels like. Then comes a darker turn. A decision whispered through corridors of power. If the people grow, the empire feels smaller. So newborns become a battlefield. The biblical story describes an order. A quiet order. A brutal one. Hebrew boys are not to live. And that is where Moses enters the frame. Not as a hero at first. As a child. A breath that survives. A mother hides him as long as she can. Then she does the unthinkable. She places him in a basket. She trusts the river that has swallowed so many. And she lets the Nile carry her son into the heart of the enemy. The scene is almost cinematic. Reeds, water, a fragile cradle drifting, and hands that find it. Pharaoh's household takes him in. The story says Moses grows up between two worlds, between the language of the palace and the pain of the worksite, between gold and dust, between authority and fear. And then, one day, the contradiction breaks him. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He reacts, violently, impulsively. The next day, the secret is no longer a secret. And Moses runs. He flees into the wilderness, into silence, into a life where the loudest sounds are wind and animals. He becomes a shepherd, a man forgotten by courts, a name erased from marble halls, until the story turns again. A mountain, a strange fire, a bush that burns without being consumed. In the biblical narrative, this is the hinge. The moment the invisible speaks. Not through armies, through a voice, through a command. Moses is not eager. He hesitates. He argues. He doubts his own tongue. But the call does not release him, so he returns, not as a prince, as a messenger. He walks back into Egypt, carrying nothing that looks like power. A staff, a robe, a promise. And when he reaches the center of the empire, the confrontation begins. Let my people go. It is not just a request. It is a challenge to Egypt's entire architecture. Because Pharaoh is not only a ruler in this world, he is the pillar of order. The one meant to keep chaos out. The living guarantee that the sun will rise and the Nile will flood. So when Moses speaks, he does not only speak to a man. He speaks against a system. And the system answers with refusal. The story says Pharaoh's heart hardens again and again. Not once, not twice, as if power itself cannot accept limits. Then come the blows. Not random disasters. Targeted fractures in the body of the empire. Water, Egypt's lifeline, turns foul. The river that feeds becomes a sign of death. Then the land begins to crawl. Frogs in houses, in beds, in bowls. The ordinary becomes unbearable. Then the air itself feels alive. Gnats, lice, insects swarming, clinging. A plague that turns dignity into misery. Then a darkness of wings. Flies, swarms, markets empty, courtyards abandoned. Then sickness in the fields. Livestock falls. Oxen, cattle. Herds that once meant wealth, now mean loss. Then skin in pain, boils, ulcers. A reminder that even bodies are not safe. Then the sky turns hostile. Hail that shreds crops. Thunder over temples. The storm enters places. Storms are not meant to enter. Then locusts, a moving shadow that devours what remains. The granaries suddenly feel fragile. Then the light itself collapses. Darkness you can feel. Darkness that traps people in their homes. As if the sun has been taken hostage. And finally, the last blow. The one the story treats as a line no empire can cross without breaking. The death of the firstborn. It is not described like a battle. It is described like a night. A hush. A shock. A city waking to a sound it has never heard before. After that night, Pharaoh yields. He lets them go. And the departure is not a parade, it is a flight. The story speaks of urgency. Bread not even finished rising. Bundles. Children. Old men. Women holding whatever they can carry. A people moving in the dark, as if dawn might change the decision. And Moses leads them out, not into a new city. Into the open. The wilderness. The borderlands. The places where maps dissolve. Then comes the turn that makes the story legendary. Pharaoh changes his mind. Because empires do not like losing labor. They do not like admitting defeat. And the text suggests something in Pharaoh cannot bear the image, slaves walking away. So the chariots roll, the army moves. Dust rises behind metal and wood. The pursuit begins. Ahead, a sea or a marshy expanse. A barrier of water. Behind, the sound of wheels, the line of soldiers tightening. A people trapped between fear and foam. And then the moment the world remembers. The waters open. A corridor appears, where there should be none. Walls of water, wind, spray. A path across the impossible. The people cross, breath held. Eyes wide, feet on wet ground. The army follows. And then the waters close. The story does not linger on details. It leaves an image. A force that swallows the instruments of empire. A silence after the roar. And the scene becomes a universal symbol. Escape. Liberation. A sea that separates the old life from the new. But behind the symbol, a sharper question remains. Who was that Pharaoh whom Moses dared to confront? The one who refused, then yielded, then pursued. The one tradition imagines swallowed up with his army. And why do we not know his name? In the story, one detail intrigues. It says Pharaoh, but never his personal name. Yet Egypt loves names. They are carved on temples, in tombs, on colossal statues, inside clearly visible cartouches. Every ruler wants to leave an eye sculpted in stone, a name that defies time. But here, nothing. Some see a theological choice. The story does not want to glorify the Pharaoh. It wants to show his limits. The Pharaoh is not a hero to remember. He is the symbol of a power that breaks. Others recall an obvious fact. Ancient texts are not written like our modern reports. They do not always seek chronological precision. They build a memory. But this silence opens a breach. And in that breach, for decades, historians, biblical scholars, and Egyptologists have tried one thing: to go back in time, to cross-check the clues, and to put a face to that anonymous pharaoh. That is where everything becomes more concrete. To identify the pharaoh of the Exodus, researchers rely on two great families of clues. First, internal clues from the biblical texts. Time markers, places, city names, elements of political setting. Second, external clues from Egyptian history. Chronologies, dynasties, capitals, carved stele, and archaeological remains. The problem is that these clues do not always line up. An old interpretive tradition places the Exodus about 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple. That would point to the 15th century before Common Era, in the time of the 18th dynasty. But another clue troubles that framework. The story mentions a city called Ramesses, associated, for many, with the Delta capital, built under a famous pharaoh, Ramesses II. Yet that capital, Pi-Ramesses, is a creation of the 13th century before Common Era. So two scenarios take shape. First scenario, the Exodus has more of a 13th century background. The places cited reflect the reality of the Ramessides. Second scenario, Ramesses would be an anachronism, a name updated by later editors. Like when one says Istanbul, to speak of a time when one still said Constantinople. It is at this precise point that everything becomes a balancing game. Which clue carries more weight? Which clue is more solid? And above all, which clue is carved in stone, literally? For the general public, the pharaoh of the Exodus often has a name: Ramesses II. Long reign, gigantic monuments, colossal temples. The archetype of the imperial pharaoh. And the main argument is seductive. The story mentions Ramesses. And the Egypt of Ramesses II indeed had a great delta capital, Pi-Ramesses. Add to that a coherent context. In the 13th century before Common Era, Egypt is still a major power, turned toward the Levant, capable of imposing massive works, controlling borders, mobilizing troops. On paper, Ramesses II fits the setting. But a rigorous look does not stop at the setting. When you look closely, two gray areas appear. First, the older chronology, the one that places the Exodus earlier, does not agree with Ramesses II. Then, and above all, official Egyptian archives do not tell of a disaster comparable to that of the Exodus. But be careful. That is not enough to exclude the Ramesses II hypothesis. For pharaonic inscriptions are not confessions. They are narratives of glory. Victories are carved, not humiliations. So Ramesses II remains a plausible hypothesis. Logical for the setting, but almost too easy. And sometimes, that is where one must be wary. The ideal culprit is often the one we choose, because he is obvious. So keep Ramesses II in mind, but continue. At this stage, the question becomes simple. Is there an Egyptian trace, an external marker, that can tell us at least this? At such a time, an Israel already exists outside Egypt. And this is where a stone enters the scene. A stele, an inscription, a royal text. The Merneptah Stele. It is famous for a precise reason. It contains one of the oldest known mentions of Israel in an Egyptian source, in the context of a campaign in Canaan. This detail is crucial. Not because it tells the Exodus, it does not, but because it fixes a marker. In the time of Merneptah, a group called Israel is already identified as present in Canaan. And as soon as that stone enters the reflection, a door opens. If the Exodus, or the event that inspired this story, has a historical anchor, then it cannot be placed just anywhere. It must be situated before, or around, this period. And suddenly, this stops being only a debate over internal chronologies. It becomes a reading guided by an external milestone. A nail driven into time. And that nail bears a name. Merneptah. Merneptah is the son and successor of Ramesses II. Less famous, less monumental, less cinema, and yet more interesting. Why? Because the Merneptah Stele does not tell us who the pharaoh of the Exodus is. But it tells us something essential. In his time, Israel is already on the other side. But be careful. This scenario remains a reconstruction. The stele does not speak of a drowned army. It speaks of victory, of propaganda, as always. So what is Merneptah worth? At least this. It rests on a dated external marker. And it fits into a credible political sequence. A vast empire. An heir after an excessive reign. A moment when Egypt begins to feel cracks, without collapsing yet. In short, Merneptah is not only a name. It is a period that holds in history. But the reflection would not be complete if it ignored the other great scenario. The early Exodus, according to the internal chronology. One could place the Exodus in the 15th century before Common Era, in the time of the 18th dynasty. And in this framework, one name often returns. Amenhotep II. He reigns in a powerful Egypt. An Egypt that wages campaigns. That brings back captives. That controls part of the Levant. Some researchers who favor this dating highlight compatible elements: population movements, Asiatic captives, changes in the workforce. This scenario has its coherence, but it meets a major difficulty. It depends on a chain of interpretations that is highly disputed, and it aligns less easily with the external markers generally discussed around the 13th century before Common Era, notably those that place Israel already present in Canaan. Amenhotep II therefore remains a serious hypothesis, but a hypothesis without a master key, defended with a constellation of clues, whereas other scenarios rest on a stone carved in time. Then comes the question everyone asks: if there was an Exodus, where are the proofs? And this is where archaeology imposes a simple rule: the absence of proof is not always proof of absence. The traces of groups moving through the desert are extremely fragile. Time erases, sand swallows, materials disappear. Moreover, ancient stories often condense complex realities: slave escapes, progressive migrations, multiple episodes. That memory gathers into one great founding story. What archaeology often does is not to prove the event in the modern sense, but to test the plausibility of the setting. Routes, fortifications, garrisons, border control, the logistics of an empire. And that setting is becoming more and more concrete. Conclusion: archaeology does not give us a name on a silver platter, but it tells us that world was real, and the tensions we imagine there are not impossible at all. At this stage, we have three main candidates: Ramesses II, the setting, the power, the capital; Amenhotep II, the early chronology some defend, a possible framework, but heavily debated; Merneptah, a less spectacular heir, but tied to a rare piece of evidence, an inscribed stele. And here is the final question: if we must give him a name, if we must end this story with a face rather than a veil, here is the strongest case. Some researchers have proposed a scenario with an almost relentless narrative logic. Ramesses II would be the pharaoh of oppression, the era of vast building projects, administrative weight, forced labor. Merneptah would be the pharaoh of the turning point, the one who sees them leave, the one who pursues, the one who loses something in that pursuit, even if the story later reshapes that loss into a total event, cosmic, symbolic. So the pharaoh of the Exodus, the ruler whom Moses dared to challenge, the one who watched a people escape that he believed he owned, the one whose power wavers in the story, is Merneptah. And that name is not only an answer, it is a cartouche carved in stone. A pharaoh who, despite his empire, remains associated with a simple idea: that a power can be immense, and yet powerless, before a people who rise, rebels, and decide to be free. If you enjoyed this journey throughout history, hit like and subscribe to our channel, so you don't miss anything.